It was a regular press conference held at the White House, a place where heated debates and questions were an everyday occurrence. The room buzzed with reporters, eager to get their chance to ask questions, and the air felt thick with anticipation. The usual politicians and their aides flanked the stage, but today, there was something different. Barron Trump, the youngest member of the first family, was stepping up to the podium to address the press for the first time. Though still a teenager, Barron had grown in the public eye, and the media had relentlessly covered his every move, sometimes cruelly, often with little regard for his age. But today, he was here to speak on behalf of his father, Donald Trump, who had just returned from a critical international summit. Among the press corps was a well-known liberal reporter, Thomas Willard, whose sharp tongue and disdain for the Trump family were no secret. Thomas had made a name for himself with his biting commentary, often making personal digs at the president and his family. Today, however, he had his sights set on Barron. The young man had been quiet for so long, but this time, he was ready to step into the spotlight. As Barron took his place at the podium, his pale blue eyes scanning the crowd, Thomas wasted no time. Raising his hand, he was called upon. "Barron," Thomas began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "we've seen you grow up before our eyes. You've kept quiet for so long. How does it feel to finally be pushed into the spotlight, knowing that the world is waiting for you to say something, anything?" The room fell silent. The other reporters leaned forward, curious about how Barron, barely more than a child, would handle the sharpness of the question. Would he crumble under the pressure? Would he fumble through a nervous response? It was clear Thomas was trying to bait him, to get a rise from the young Trump. But then, something unexpected happened. Barron leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. He didn't flinch or look away. The crowd was taken aback, unsure of what to expect next. His voice was calm and collected, without a hint of hesitation. Barron's voice broke the silence, low but firm. "It's strange," he said, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. "You've spent so much time focusing on my family, trying to tear us apart, and now, you want me to entertain you?" The room was stunned. The reporters exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. This was not the response they expected. Barron continued, his posture straightening as he spoke. "I've grown up in a world where people think they have the right to say whatever they want about me, my family, or my father. But the truth is, none of you know us. You only know what you've been fed." He paused, looking around the room, his eyes scanning each reporter as if daring anyone to challenge him. "And honestly, I'm tired of it." Thomas blinked, taken aback by the bluntness of Barron's response. The liberal reporter, who had prided himself on his ability to get under the skin of his targets, found himself momentarily at a loss for words. The room, still shocked, waited for him to respond. But Barron wasn't done. "If you're expecting some emotional outburst from me, or a tearful apology for being part of this family, you'll be disappointed," he said, his tone unwavering. "I'm not here for your entertainment. I'm here to speak the truth." The reporters were silent, some scribbling furiously in their notepads, while others simply stared at Barron in disbelief. This wasn't the meek, quiet boy they were used to seeing in the tabloids. This was someone who had clearly been paying attention, someone who wasn't afraid to speak his mind. Thomas, still recovering from the unexpected turn of events, found his voice again. "You speak of truth, Barron, but what truth is that? The truth of your father's presidency? Or the truth that you and your family have insulated yourselves from the very reality that the rest of us face?" Barron's response was quick, cutting through Thomas's rhetoric like a knife. "The truth, Mr. Willard, is that you've spent years trying to tear us down, but you've never once asked yourself why. You've never bothered to understand why we do what we do, why my father believes in what he believes." The room was now on edge. No one had ever seen Barron speak this confidently, this directly, and certainly not in such an unapologetic tone. Even the most seasoned journalists could sense that something significant was unfolding. Thomas, who was known for his aggressive stance in interviews, seemed to struggle for a moment, his usual snide commentary losing its sharp edge. He glanced at the other reporters, gauging their reactions, before finally attempting to regain control of the conversation. "All right, Barron," Thomas said, his voice tinged with mock sincerity. "So, if you think we've got it all wrong, why don't you tell us, what is the real story behind your family? What are we not seeing that you believe we should?" Barron didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his presence growing stronger by the second. "You're not asking the right questions, Mr. Willard. You're asking for the narrative that fits your agenda, not the truth. But if you really want to know, I'll tell you." He paused, as if considering the weight of his words. "For years, the media has painted us as villains, as people who don't care about the struggles of ordinary Americans. But the truth is, we've fought hard to protect this country, to make decisions that benefit it, even if they're not popular. What you don't see is the toll it takes on my family. You don't see the sacrifices my father has made, or the sleepless nights he's endured, trying to do what he believes is best." Barron's voice was calm but resolute. He wasn't angry, but there was a firmness to his words that made it clear he wasn't backing down. The entire room was hanging on his every word. "And you," Barron continued, turning back to Thomas, "you sit in front of your camera, passing judgment from a distance, never acknowledging the real cost of the choices we make. You want to criticize my father? Fine. But don't pretend you're doing it for the good of the country when all you're really doing is pushing your own agenda." There was a brief silence, and then a murmur rippled through the room. Some reporters began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to process what Barron had just said. Others were taking notes feverishly, aware that this moment was history in the making. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to be caught in his throat. Barron had completely turned the tables on him. The young man, who had always been viewed as an easy target for ridicule, had just silenced one of the most outspoken liberal reporters in the room. The tension in the room was palpable. Barron wasn't finished yet, though. He still had one last thing to say, and he knew it would leave everyone in stunned silence. Barron took a deep breath and looked around the room, his gaze steady. For a moment, the weight of the silence seemed to press down on everyone. The reporters were still, hanging on every word as if they were waiting for Barron to deliver some final punchline. But instead, he spoke with a quiet intensity that held everyone captive. "You think I don't understand what's happening?" Barron asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You think I don't see the way the media twists everything to suit its narrative? You think I don't see the hate, the division, the way you tear down people who don't agree with you? I see it, Mr. Willard. I see it every single day." There was a calmness to Barron's tone, a restraint that made his words even more chilling. He wasn't angry. He wasn't raising his voice. He was simply speaking the truth, and it was more powerful than any rant. "I've learned something over the years," Barron continued, now addressing the entire room. "It's not about the headlines, or the insults, or the Twitter posts. It's about the people we affect, the ones who look up to us and see hope. My father doesn't do this for the media. He doesn't do it for the praise. He does it because he believes in something bigger than all of this, bigger than the power games you all play." At this point, some of the reporters in the room were visibly shaken. They were used to seeing politicians, or even their children, cower or try to appease the press. But Barron had done neither. He had confronted them head-on, with a maturity that no one had expected. He shifted his gaze back to Thomas. "And as for you, Mr. Willard," Barron said, his voice still measured, but with a slight edge now, "you're free to keep pushing your agenda, but know this, you can't tear us down. Not now. Not ever." The room was completely still. No one moved, no one spoke. For a moment, it felt as though time had frozen. Barron had just delivered the kind of reply that could silence even the loudest critics. The young Trump had proven that there was more to him than anyone had ever realized. Thomas, now visibly flustered, opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His usual arrogance had evaporated in the face of Barron's calm, piercing truth. He quickly looked around the room, realizing that the moment was slipping away from him. Barron, however, wasn't finished yet. He gave a small, confident nod to the room of reporters and turned to walk away from the podium. As he did, a few reporters started to whisper to each other, some even nodding in agreement with Barron's words. And as Barron exited the room, the entire press conference was left in stunned silence, unsure of what had just happened. One thing was clear, though: Barron Trump had just proven to the world that he was not to be underestimated. As Barron exited the press room, the murmurs of the reporters only grew louder. Some were still trying to process what had just transpired, others were quickly typing on their phones, eager to get the story out first. The press conference, meant to be just another routine affair, had suddenly turned into something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. Back in the White House hallway, Barron's footsteps echoed softly as he made his way toward the exit. His father, Donald Trump, was waiting for him just outside the room, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. He had been watching from behind the scenes, listening to his son's every word, and it was clear he was proud. "Well done, Barron," Donald said, his voice low but filled with approval. Barron gave a small nod, his usual reserved demeanor still intact. He didn't say anything in return, but his father didn't expect him to. The look in Barron's eyes said it all: he had done what he had come to do, and he had done it in a way that left a mark on everyone present. As the press began to scramble to cover the story, the reactions poured in. Across news channels, social media platforms, and political blogs, the event was the topic of every conversation. The public's reaction on Twitter, hashtags like #BarronSpeaks and #TrumpFamilyTruth were trending within minutes. Liberal commentators, who had once vilified Barron and his family, were suddenly scrambling to frame the narrative. Was Barron just defending his father, or had he revealed something deeper? A few conservative pundits, however, took the moment as a victory, praising Barron for his composure and clarity. An article from a major news outlet later that day read, "Barron Trump shocks nation with poised, unflinching response to media attacks." It was a headline no one had expected, especially not from the press that had been so quick to criticize him in the past. Barron had turned the narrative on its head. Meanwhile, Barron, now back in his quiet space within the White House, sat alone in his room, reflecting on the chaos of the day. The press had come for him, hoping to find weakness, to expose some hidden flaw. Instead, they had found strength, something they never expected from him. But Barron wasn't thinking about the media frenzy or the headlines. He knew that the real battle was still ahead. The press had tested him today, but he had passed. What mattered now was the long-term impact of his words, words that had shaken the foundation of how the media viewed not just him, but the entire Trump family. He had shown the world that he wasn't just the quiet son of the president. He was a force to be reckoned with, and no amount of media scrutiny would change that. The following days after the press conference were a whirlwind. The media coverage was relentless. Every news outlet had picked up the story, analyzing Barron's words from every angle. Some hailed him as the new voice of the Trump family, calm, composed, and refreshingly direct. Others, especially from more liberal corners, painted him as a product of a deeply flawed system, someone who had inherited his father's combative nature. But Barron's response was silent. He stayed out of the public eye, as he always had, choosing to observe rather than engage. He knew the storm would pass, and when it did, he would still be standing. The attention, however, was not lost on those around him. At home, in the family quarters of the White House, the atmosphere was different. Barron's mother, Melania Trump, had been quietly watching the news coverage, her face inscrutable as she flipped through the channels. She had always been protective of Barron, careful to shield him from the harsh realities of politics, but she could see the shift in her son. He wasn't the same boy who had once avoided the media spotlight. There was an undeniable strength in his eyes now, one that wasn't there before. She joined him in his room one evening, sitting down beside him in the silence. Barron didn't speak at first, his attention on the window overlooking the gardens of the White House, his expression unreadable. "You did well today," Melania said quietly, her voice soft but laced with pride. Barron finally turned his gaze to her, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I said what needed to be said." Melania nodded, understanding more than words could convey. "The media will try to twist it. They always do." "They will," Barron replied, his voice steady. "But they don't understand. They never will. They think they can control the narrative, but they can't. I'm not going to let them." Melania's eyes softened as she regarded her son. She had always known he was different from the others, more thoughtful, more observant. He wasn't impulsive like his father or driven by the need for attention. Barron's way was quieter, more deliberate, but no less powerful. "It's not easy, Barron. The world will expect more from you now," she warned, though her tone held no judgment, only the wisdom of someone who had seen the pressures of public life firsthand. Barron nodded again, his gaze returning to the window. "I'm ready." The next day, a new wave of scrutiny came. This time, it wasn't just from reporters. There were online forums, social media influencers, and even some political figures taking sides. Was Barron truly his father's son? Had he become a symbol of the future of the Trump family dynasty, or was he merely a pawn in a larger game? Then came an unexpected development. The unexpected development came in the form of a public statement issued by none other than Thomas Willard, the reporter who had initiated Barron's confrontation during the press conference. After days of silence, Thomas finally spoke out in an exclusive interview, attempting to defend his earlier comments. But the interview took a surprising turn. He began by acknowledging Barron's strength, admitting that the young Trump had surprised him with his calm and his poise under pressure. "I've been in this industry for over 2 decades, Thomas said on live television, and I've seen politicians, businessmen, and public figures crumble under the weight of media scrutiny. But Barron Trump, he's different. He's not the frightened child the press had painted him to be. He's smart, and he's aware of the world around him. And that's something I didn't give him credit for." The public reaction to Thomas's admission was mixed. Some saw it as a begrudging acknowledgement of Barron's strength, a recognition of the young man's resilience. Others viewed it as an attempt to save face after being so publicly humbled by Barron's words. But for Barron, it didn't matter. The media would continue to twist and turn his words, trying to fit him into whatever narrative suited their agenda. But he was no longer the vulnerable figure they thought they could manipulate. He had claimed his voice, and it was louder than ever. Weeks passed, and the media frenzy began to subside. Barron resumed his quiet life at the White House, but he was different now. More composed. More aware. He had learned that while the media could try to control the narrative, it was ultimately his story to tell. In private moments with his family, Barron began to engage more. He wasn't just the quiet observer anymore, he had a new understanding of his role, not just as the son of the president, but as a person with his own identity, his own beliefs, and his own voice. And so, Barron Trump continued to walk the tightrope of public life, a young man under the microscope, but no longer intimidated by it. He had shown the world that he could stand on his own, that he was more than just the subject of headlines, and that when pushed to the edge, he could push back. The world may have underestimated Barron Trump, but after that day, no one would ever forget him.